Hello, today we're talking to Therese Sands. Therese is one of the co-executive directors of People with Disability Australia, and she's recently also been seconded to be the director of Disabled People's Organisations Australia, which she did for a couple of years. Therese has worked for 25 years in education, policy development, capacity building and advocacy in the area of disability and human rights. A key area of her work focuses on engaging with international human rights mechanisms to progress the rights of people with disability. She's participated on NGO working groups preparing parallel reports under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CEDAW, and for the Universal Periodic Review. She also coordinated the Australian NGO Parallel Report for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and co-led the NGO delegation to the UN for the CRPD review of Australia in 2013. Therese has also worked with DPOs in the Asia Pacific region on a range of capacity building projects, including delivering training on the CRPD to DPOs and government representatives in Pacific Island countries and training and support to Asian DPOs on the development of CRPD parallel reports. And in fact, I'm speaking to Therese today where she's at the United Nations for the Council of States Parties. Welcome, Therese.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks for having me.
And it's fantastic that we could manage to find a time because Australia and the UN are not very much in the same time zone at all. So how are you staying awake?
Well, yeah, great difficulty, lots of jet lag to push through. But we've been here a few days now and we're into the sort of penultimate day. We've got one more day of the actual cost. That the meeting with the governments that have ratified the convention. But it's been a very busy time. So pretty exhausting really, but exciting.
So what kind of work is there available for NGOs or civil society representatives to do? I mean, why would you turn up at a meeting of governments?
Well, there's lots of activity from civil society, from disabled people's organisations and people with disability themselves. And in many ways, because the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is very strong and quite clearly places an obligation on states parties to include people with disability in decision-making forums, we tend to come and quite really demand and feel like we have some ownership over deliberations and discussions. We have a lot of influence that we can bring to the meetings over various issues and concerns. And the day before the government meet, there is a civil society forum where civil society from around the world gathers and discusses key issues that will happen during the meeting. And so there is lots of activity from making formal interventions into the meeting. So for example, I was just in the meeting holding a round table on women and girls with disabilities. So a member of our delegation from Women with Disabilities Australia made an intervention on laws that impact on women and girls' bodies, such as forced sterilisation and forced treatments. So they can be powerful statements, and states parties are all in the room and they have to take note of our voice.
That's fantastic because there's not actually a very high presence of people with disability at the UN in other spaces, is there? This is really a good meeting where there's a fairly strong presence, but in some of those other areas, mainstream areas that aren't disability specific, it's still a pretty low presence. So this inclusion is quite unusual in a way.
Well, it is, and I suppose it's not unusual for a disability meeting, but you're right, we probably don't have the same ability to engage in other forums or to be included in the same way. I think it's something that we certainly, probably all of us as activists or advocates want to do and think would be a really strategic thing to be doing. But, you know, the UN is fairly large bureaucratic organisation and it can be very difficult to understand procedures and processes and all of the ways you need to engage. So it can be quite intimidating. when you aren't welcome or not readily included. So outside the disability space, I imagine it's very daunting.
And it was actually something I wanted to talk to you about, is that it's quite a formal space, very structured. There's a lot of process-driven, forums and activities that go on, and it's not really the kind of place you turn up, is it, and just do something. It takes a long period of building up and lobbying and getting the understanding in often before there's any outcomes of any kind. How have you worked with that over the years? Because you've engaged in quite a number of different forums over the years, and often it's over the same subject matter.
Yeah, that's right. I think, it's like any process though, or even your own, working with your own governments. It's about learning systems and how they work. And so you need to have a lot of connections internationally with people who do this kind of thing all the time. So organisations like the International Disability Alliance will provide assistance if you need to check how you might engage or what you can do to engage. It really is about coming and just throwing yourself into whatever you can. But you do have to get guidance on the processes to do that. So, where do you put your name down to make a formal intervention? You can't just go to a meeting and then put your hand up and you're going to be asked. You have to know how to sit at the table, even simple things like turning the microphone on and waiting for the red light or something like that. You do need assistance and guidance, but doing it and being prepared to network with other people who know how it's done and then give it a go yourself. I think once you do that, you just build confidence and you then feel more comfortable in using these processes. And I think part of my work and what I really like doing is sharing that with other people and giving other people opportunities so they can learn the system. And more of us are able to engage in UN human rights mechanisms.
And it's interesting too, because you're not there on your own. You're actually leading a delegation of about 23 NGO reps from Australia on this particular trip, isn't it? So, that means there's a really wide array of people. They've all got something they want to be pushing. How do you manage that delegation type of activity so that you have a sense of being a common presence and not just 23 different people?
Well, what we've done, and we've had a lot of support from government. We try to work with the Australian government delegation on this. So prior to leaving, we actually held 2 workshops about a couple of months apart. The first workshop to talk about the UN system and what it's like, to talk about what it means to be part of a delegation, how to coordinate our activities. And while we're all coming from different organisations, we'll have slightly different priorities and views, and that's fine. It's just about ensuring everyone knows what you're doing. So we have things like WhatsApp groups, where we're all on it, we're all telling each other which side events we're at, what meetings we're going to. We're trying to support each other. We're telling the government what's happening as well. And at those pre-meetings, that's what we've set up. And we've got a program which plots out our activities, and then people even know where everyone's staying. We're meeting sort of after the formal meetings to debrief and discuss what's happening. We meet with the government quite regularly throughout the meetings. We even met with the minister this time, as she was present for this meeting. So a lot of my role is very much about coordination of that, not so much directing what actually happens, but sharing opportunities, if people want to make interventions, how they do it, what they might say, and then, we try and support each other's work. So, that is what I think has been quite successful in terms of being able to be united, I suppose, and look at a very coordinated delegation, even though we might be doing very different things throughout the day and not see each other for periods of time as we do those things.
So, what you've just described there is a process, again, where you don't just turn up at the UN and stick your hand up. You've actually started way back months ago, or even a year back, at home, starting to prepare and coordinate people, and even talking to government about some of the issues that you might want to be raising, so that it is a highly coordinated approach.
I think that's right. It's you. If you just turned up without any preparation, you really wouldn't be able to take advantage of the opportunities, because you would be a bit behind the eight ball in knowing what to expect and what you needed to look out for. And you wouldn't be networked in. A lot of it for civil society is really knowing your networks, building those networks, so that you get a lot of information and you know, kind of the issues and events that are going to be priorities for people. So it's definitely about preparation and coordination.
And then once you're there, Therese, it isn't just the group that you're part of, the Australian group. There's also that caucusing with other country civil society groups as well. And how do you interact with those other groups and the International Alliance, for example?
Well, what we try and do with, in terms of those international groups, is we try and have formal meetings with them. So the International Disability Alliance does coordinate the civil society engagement, and so prior to the actual civil society forum and formal meetings, they hold a meeting as well, and they brief civil society on what is happening. And then there's an opportunity to ask questions, find out what others are doing, to share information about key issues and priorities. And then we kind of begin the networking from there and what we're going to be saying or doing. And so there's a lot of engagement and work with other civil society groups, and that's, you know, that's quite important. Some of those groups are at the international level, like Human Rights Watch, and some are in-country groups, you know, like Disabled People's Association Vanuatu, for example. So they're really great connections, and it's quite amazing how there are very similar issues internationally for people with disability. And so there's a lot of common ground, a lot of support for issues.
And it's interesting too, because at this particular meeting, Australia also had someone that we were putting forward for election to the actual committee, the treaty committee, the CRPD committee, and so that's a government activity. The state looks after that process. But of course, civil society is engaged with the state on that process, or with the country, the government. But then you've got groups of governments that start to develop when you've got election processes. So there's groupings of civil society, but then there's also the groupings of government. How do you work in some of that really complex mix of things going on?
Well, to a certain extent, the governments do have their own process, and there's not a lot of room for civil society to influence states, except for the fact that in terms of the nomination of Rosemary Hayes for the committee, we of course wrote a nomination letter. We had endorsements from civil society in Australia. We had international endorsements from well-respected international human rights experts and people with disability. And we also, once the government accepted the nomination, we were sending out information, all the promotion material the government produced, we sent to civil society networks we had in our countries and asked them to lobby their governments to support Rosemary's nomination. So we were just trying to do our bit through civil society in terms of the lobbying we could do. A lot of the actual getting the support is done government to government in bilateral meetings, which we're obviously not privy to. We certainly talk to our government about how those bilaterals are going, how much they think the support is there. And we certainly can emphasise that we support Rosemary. We supported our Australian candidate to government reps, but a lot of that government-to-government bilateral work we're not privy to, but we're trying to support it as much as possible.
Yeah, and again, that's a long lobbying effort. It's taken a couple of years of behind the scenes work to start writing those letters to get that international endorsement gathering and to make sure the government was really behind the process of getting Rosemary elected.
Yes, it does take time. All of the processes at the UN are not quick and take a lot of time. It is like a massive bureaucracy, and you're working with governments to government in that massive bureaucracy. So there's a whole process within Australia that has to take place for the government to accept the nomination, then to put the candidate forward, and then to start all of the electioneering and bilateral arrangements, and there's a whole lot of diplomatic negotiations that take place in relation to that. And so it does take considerable time, and certainly that's the case in this case as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what's the purpose of doing this? I mean, why would civil society bother going to the UN? There's so much hard work, and it's all about trying to influence government. But is it really about those outcomes documents? Is that the focus?
I think it's sort of a multiplicity of things, really. One is just having networks across civil society, DPOs in other countries, in our region, DPOs in Australia, DPOs internationally. You are really sort of fostering the disability rights movement in that respect. So you're making the connections. You are really building positions and views and supporting those across different regions and internationally. And then there's, of course, is the work with government and trying to influence the meeting outcomes, absolutely. And those meeting outcomes can have quite significant influence for how the CRPD is implemented internationally. And of course, if we can influence that's really critical. It will have an impact on Australia in terms of those kinds of implementation measures, whether it's happening in another part of the world or not. I think the point of it is yes, we're at the UN and a global forum, which seems far removed from our daily lives in Australia. But in effect, really, it's about taking local to global and then global to local and back again. So the point of it is to actually create change in our backyard and in our own lives, even though at the time we seem far removed. But that's what we're trying to do, is create local change through ensuring that the global documents or international documents that are produced have local impact.
Absolutely. I'm really conscious you're at the end of a very, very long day. So I'm going to ask you the one final question that we ask everybody, which is, who is a leader you admire and why?
Well, I'd have to say, given I'm at the UN and I've just seen Rosemary Kayes elected as our, representative on the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability, I would certainly see Rosemary Kayes as a key leader in our rights, in advocating for our rights, and particularly in terms of intersectionality and looking at the whole intersections between disability, gender, race, ethnicity, LGBTI intersections. It's just, wonderful to have someone of her calibre there and truly leading the way. So I'd have to say that, but I'm certainly having celebrated her successful election yesterday.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much for making time for us today, Therese Sands, in an enormously busy week, and you've got a lot more to do today, I think, probably before you're out. So, and we look forward to catching up when you're back in Australia.
Thanks very much, Christina, for the opportunity.